Yeah, I'm waiting for it to start.
Welcome to the international launch of Professor John Lewis's book, Road Trip to Nowhere, Hollywood Encounters the Counterculture. Tonight's a very special hybrid event with Professor Lewis joining us on Zoom and Professors Cynthia Henderson and Andrew Utterson here with us. Thank you for joining us today for this important event, inaugurating the third week of the 2023 Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, or FLEF. I am Anne Michelle, part of the FLEF team and one of the festival producers. FLEF is now in its 26th year. It is the second oldest environmental film festival in the U.S. It's not only environmental; it's a human rights film festival as well.
Oh, there she is. I couldn't see.
Okay.
Look how small it is.
Hello from out there. Zoom world, it's great. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight from Ithaca and from the region. I would also like to thank Dr. Thomas Bone, Dr. Andrew Utterson, and Dr. Arzu Karaduman, the professors teaching Hollywood and American film, and for their generosity and graciousness in opening up their class to this part of FLEF 2023. We also extend our thanks for support of the festival to the Park Foundation and to Adelaide Park Gomer. Our festival's theme this year is polyphonies, the idea of many voices layered together. Our speakers and performers are joined together with all of you in this auditorium, embodying the idea of polyphony. We acknowledge that we are mounting this festival and convening our communities together for discussion within the context beyond Ithaca and our current moment. Ithaca is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, which is a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Confederacy is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca College, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Cayuga Nation dispossession. We honor the ongoing connection of the Cayuga Nation people, past and present, to these lands and waters. We ask you to remember that the 2023 festival takes place as global climate catastrophe intensifies, as the Russian war in Ukraine continues, as polarizations about race, gender, sexualities, identities, nations, politics, land, air, and water deepen across the globe, and as people across the world endure violence, yet continue to fight for democracy, equality, freedom of expression, and a livable planet. At the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, the world is our why. And now, it is with deep pleasure that we open tonight's FLEF event with words of support and a salute from one of the major voices in the fight for climate justice and social justice, 2-time Oscar winner, Jane Fonda.
Greetings, festival goers. I'm Jane Fonda, and I'm here to salute the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, now in its 26th year. Wow, for stretching and galvanizing us to think differently about the environment. Their theme this year is polyphonies, the idea of multiple voices joined together as the second oldest environmental film festival in the United States. The Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival has 2 mottos that signal what we all need to do in this current era of global climate catastrophes. First, FLEF, a different environment. Second, FLEF, the world is our why. Congratulations to the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival for pushing us to rethink, to recalibrate, and to reimagine what a livable environment for all could do and could look like. I'm also here to salute the international launch of Professor John Lewis's new book, Road Trip to Nowhere, Hollywood Encounters the Counterculture. Professor Lewis writes about me in chapter 3, entitled Four Women in Hollywood: Jean Seberg, Jane Fonda, Dolores Hart, and Barbara Loden. This book recovers an important history that has been ignored and marginalized: the commercial and political impact on Hollywood of the 60s counterculture. Both the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival and this new book, Road Trip to Nowhere, spurs us to consider the necessity and impact of political activism and the importance of rising up together to demand a more just, more equitable, and more livable world. And as I have said in many, many different venues and across many different media, and in my book, What Can I Do? My Path from Climate Despair to Action, the cure for despair is action. You know, I'm going to quote Greta Thunberg too. Don't go looking for hope. Look for action and hope will come. I know that many of you at this festival tonight are members of the Ithaca community or the Ithaca College faculty. And I hope that and suspect that many of you are college students. Figuring out how to navigate this turbulent new world of ongoing pandemic, massive inequities, and global climate catastrophe. And let me offer you a way forward. The world must be your why. We must all join together to fight for a different environment. This is a collective crisis that requires collective action. Individualism has to be set aside, hopefully forever. And all of us together, young and old, of all ethnicities and races, shapes and sizes, must become a polyphony of different voices to fight for the environment, to save this planet. And to do that, we must all take action. Then we will be hopeful, and we're going to work together wherever and however we can. Together. We got to do it together.
Those are really wonderful, inspiring words and difficult to follow, but I will let you know that Jane Fonda will be appearing at various times throughout our conversation tonight. But now, in the words of John Lewis in his account of Hollywood's engagement with the counterculture in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. My name is Andrew Utterson, one of the professors of film at Ithaca College, and really delighted to be with you this evening as we explore this brand new book, celebrate it, and have a chance to delve into its ideas. I want to welcome guests near and far, including our very special guest, John Lewis, joining us via Zoom all the way from Oregon. We'll welcome him to our big screen in just a moment's time. But I know there are others on Zoom too, and we honor and welcome you. In terms of where we are in person, we are in Ithaca, New York, at Ithaca College, in our Roy H. Park School of Communications, and I see a packed house before me in our park auditorium. The format for tonight will be a moderated discussion, so some conversation with Professor Lewis just to explore and delve into this road trip to nowhere, but an opportunity to experience those lyrical, vibrant, rich and vivid words through the voice of our actor, Cynthia Henderson, who will read some passages from John Lewis's new book, before we open out to you, our audience, for your questions and an opportunity to discuss this brand new book with Professor Lewis. Indeed, all of this is to celebrate the ideas that this new book explores. Road Trip to Nowhere, Hollywood Encounters the Counterculture, published by the esteemed University of California Press. Professor Lewis, just to say a few words to give you a sense of his standing in our field and his contributions to knowledge within our field. Professor Lewis is University Distinguished Professor of Film Studies at Oregon State University and is the author and editor of no fewer than 16 books chronicling the history of American cinema and American society beyond. Indeed, as he writes in the introduction to this new book, quote, "The movies, the ostensible product of the Hollywood industry, are in fact only ever just part of the story," end quote. As we welcome him to our screen, I want to say that over the course of 4 decades now, Professor Lewis's writing consistently explores the whole story, placing these sounds and images within the social, political, and cultural contexts in which they find their greatest power, meaning, and impact. We see John Lewis there. One last point about Professor Lewis. Professor Lewis is also, he told me a little while back, a native New Yorker and studied as an undergraduate with our good neighbors at Hobart College, now Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York, on the shores of Seneca Lake, one Finger Lake to our west, which means that tonight's Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival event has at least 2 of our Finger Lakes covered, but will no doubt tell a much wider story too. We could please give Professor Lewis a warm Ithaca College and Cayuga Lake welcome, a rousing round of applause. I'm shifting to this seat so I can see John too, and John can hopefully see me and the rest of our audience. I told John just before we started that this room is not mine, so that he would see a lot of this, but not necessarily hear the thunderous round of applause that we heard to welcome him. John, congratulations on your new book, and thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thanks. What a great introduction. Thank you.
I have a few questions just to locate us, to give us a sense of your road trip to nowhere. And then we will delve into the words themselves by way of Cynthia. Could you locate us, map out for us, please, John, this journey, our road trip to nowhere? Where are we headed in history? Who will we encounter on this trip? And why the uncertain or negatively defined destination?
Well, as Jane Fonda said in the introduction, this is a oddly under-examined period in Hollywood film history, roughly 1967 to 1976. And I was particularly interested initially in one actor named Christopher Jones that probably very few people in the audience have even heard of. And the project began as a sort of whatever happened to this guy, Christopher Jones. And it dovetailed out because he, in a way, his story was the story of the era. So we begin with his arrival in Hollywood right around 1967, and then his disappearance in the early 1970s. So Jones went from a bit part actor and TV actor to being a movie star to living on the streets in the space of like 4 years. And so I was interested in him, and then interested in the era, and discovered that there were a lot of stories like Jones' story. And that became the initial focus of the book.
In dipping into a countercultural moment, could I ask to map out that tension between the culture of this moment and what the counterculture was pushing against? And to frame it, Jane Fonda mentioned the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival slogan, "A different environment." What was the prevailing environment in the 1960s that the counterculture was seeking to challenge and find a different alternative to?
Well, this era is generally, film historians refer to it as the transition era. because it's not the classical era, which is sort of collapsed after World War II, and it's not the new Hollywood quite yet, or it's at least it's just the very beginnings of it. And I was interested in how Hollywood tried to accommodate, in other words, its encounter with the counterculture, that on the one level, it was still clinging to the sort of glamour of the classical era. And then you have this counterculture era that was rejecting materialism, that was rejecting the sort of ceremony of celebrity. And I was interested in how Hollywood tried to figure this out, and they mostly didn't. The few successes in this era, The Graduate, and Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Easy Rider 2 years later, were accidents. They were films that the studios didn't understand, that studio executives didn't get. And then when they were successful, they had to try to figure out how to duplicate it, and they didn't do a particularly good job of it. So I'm sort of interested in this sort of tension of this sort of very anti-celebrity movement among celebrities themselves, and then a Hollywood industry that was never really sort of outfitted for dealing with this. And, you know, some of the people I write about, like Gene Seberg, were involved with the Black Panthers. You know, the Hollywood sort of marketing and promotion outfit, well, you know, they had no idea what to do with that. And no idea what to do with the drug culture, no idea what to do with the Manson story, all of which are part of the stories I tell in the book.
The wider context is one of radical possibility and all sorts of tensions and visions and contested visions of what American society should look and feel like. I want to ask, as a way into that, a somewhat personal question, John, in terms of how aware or not you were of what was happening around you, because I've done the maths and I know you are a very, very, very young man at that time.
Yeah, so I was 12 in 1967, so I doubt I even saw The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde when they came out. And the book opens with a long discussion of Warner Brothers' sort of inability to figure out what was going on in Bonnie and Clyde. And then when it was a huge success, trying to take advantage of it, again, with having no idea. You know, Hollywood's always looking for a formula, and there was no formula. I probably sort of arrived in this era more at Easy Rider. I remember going to see Easy Rider as probably a 14-year-old with my parents, and it was a very weird experience to watch that movie with my parents and have to explain the counterculture to them. A counterculture I was too young to be part of. I didn't have a driving license. I didn't do drugs. I didn't have a motorcycle. I was in middle school. So I guess my experience is I sort of remember this, but I'm interested in the era nonetheless.
And so we will flip between different tenses and different time periods, and we have the 14-year-old John Lewis experiencing the counterculture a little bit from afar, and now returning to the counterculture in this countercultural moment. And we also have Jane Fonda's life and career. We'll come back to Jane Fonda in a little bit, but we obviously started with her in the present. So my last question before we shift into thinking a little bit about Easy Rider and welcoming Cynthia to the stage is about the impetus, about the spur to go back in time. You mentioned that this particular story is underrepresented and the 60s as a whole, endlessly fascinating, but was there a specific prompt or event or a particular parallel or a lesson you wanted to draw that stemmed from what's happening in the world today?
Oh, I don't know if it has. It's an interesting question, but I don't know that it has that much to do with today. I think it has more to do with, as a historian, I'm less interested in the stories of the best and the brightest, and more interested in people who don't quite make it. So I wrote a book previous to this one called Hard-Boiled Hollywood, and it was about the 40s and 50s and different figures who different celebrities who just didn't quite make it. So it's sort of framed from the Black Dahlia murder to the death by misadventure of Marilyn Monroe. So I went into this project sort of interested in the same thing, that, you know, who are the people who we haven't heard of, and the movies maybe we don't know much about, and what do their experiences tell us about Hollywood. So I think that was more the approach I was interested in.
In terms of those who didn't quite make it, Easy Rider is the example we want to turn to give you your first taste of John Lewis's vivid prose. It's a really revealing passage that we'll dip into. Is there something you would like to say, just a sentence or two, John, to frame this before we welcome Cynthia to read from your book?
Yeah, a couple of things. Easy Rider was pitched to all the studios and none of them wanted it, and was produced by an independent company known at the time for producing the Monkees TV show. And when they finally found a distributor after the film was complete, it's what's called a negative pickup. The film was picked up after it was already done. The studio really didn't know what they were dealing with either. They didn't, you know, it was a modest production, was made for significantly less than $1 million, and didn't have much enthusiasm about it and didn't really understand it. And then the film was a sensation, an absolute sensation. And then, as it sounds like I tell the same story over and over in the book, which I kind of do, that the studios then had to adjust, like, had to figure out, well, what's the formula here? And they had no idea. So the film was a sensation because it tapped into the zeitgeist in a profound way, a way that the executives at the studios were never disposed to understand. And that's why the film, I think, is so interesting. I'm not exactly sure of the exact passage you're reading, so I don't want to spoil it, but there's a story that dovetails off of this that I'll tell if that's not in this section after we see this.
That is a good teaser. And I will just say, you have a lovely one-word description for the response of the Hollywood studios. You would think they'd be delighted, ecstatic, that they'd captured the zeitgeist, but the one-word description of their response is panic, because they have no idea how to follow it up beyond. We will welcome Cynthia to read a passage that is titled, Easy Rider Changes Everything. I wanted to just celebrate Cynthia before she does read and tell you a little bit more about Cynthia Henderson. Cynthia Henderson, IC's very own, is a renowned actor, director, and author who's worked in countless venues near and far, from Ithaca, New York, to continents around the globe, always with a pressing concern for social justice, including as the recipient of a New York State Award for outstanding contribution to social justice. Can we welcome Cynthia Henderson to read the words of John Lewis?
Hey, great. Hi. Easy Rider changes everything. Easy Rider depicted, absent the usual Hollywood hand-wringing, the wilder and darker side of American youth culture, and included scenes of brutal interpersonal violence, a fact of life in a divided nation and a real-world anxiety for many young Americans nationwide. The film's biker heroes, Billy, played by Dennis Hopper, and Wyatt, Peter Fonda, find on their road trip an America in tense transition, with stops along the way at a bucolic commune populated by turned-on, dropped-out city kids, and the Deep South, where the hippie bikers are reviled and eventually murdered. In Easy Rider, Billy and Wyatt do their own thing, but that thing makes them unwelcome most everywhere they go. They are in so many of the places they visit, victims of snap judgments made about their looks and unconventional lifestyle, that they are judged so harshly and so superficially, explains why they and the actors who play them captured the attention and affection of so many young film goers, so many Americans who felt similarly misjudged and mistreated. Only once during their travels do they feel fully welcome at the aforementioned commune, where they spend a perfect day in the arms of the hippie counterculture. A better endorsement for hippie culture would be hard to find, hard to imagine, but the production backstory tells a different tale. And it is revealing. During the development stages of the project, Hopper negotiated with the new Buffalo commune in Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico, sited near his future home in Taos. But the young men and women there regarded Hollywood, even the counterculture version of Hollywood that Hopper and Fonda represented, as crack and commercial, and declined participation in the film. So Hopper had to fashion a replica near, of all places, Malibu, California. Ironic then that a town in the deep South where Billy and Wyatt are most certainly not welcome facilitated the film's most memorable live shoot. The now notorious luncheonette scene was shot direct cinema style in Morganza, Louisiana, with support from local merchants and talent. Armed with lightweight handheld cameras and mobile sound gear, Hopper gave the impromptu cast dialogue ideas and encouraged them to improvise. He got what he was after, capturing the regional and racist tension that abounded in the Deep South. The luncheonette scene presages two moments of horrifying violence. The first follows soon after the heroes leave Morganza. They ride a ways down the road and make camp for the night. Around the campfire, they share a joint and some speculative drug-induced conversation, and then bed down under the stars. As they lie asleep, they are attacked and George is killed by, we gather, the men at the luncheonette, one of whom had earlier remarked coldly, "They'll never make it to Paris line." The second follows an acid trip in a New Orleans graveyard, during which Billy and Wyatt dally with two prostitutes, played by the actress Karen Black and the choreographer and pop singer Tony Basil. On the road again, Louisiana Highway 105, just outside Hot Springs to be specific, the bikers have one final encounter with two rednecks, played by Johnny David and DC Bilodeau. Two locals called on to play versions of themselves, during which they are gunned down in cold blood. As we witness these murders, we hear the Bob Dylan song, "It's all right, Ma, I'm only bleeding," performed for the film by the Byrds frontman, Roger McGinn. The song offers an ironic coda. Our heroes are certainly bleeding, and they are most surely not all right.
Temptation page flies out the door. You follow, find yourself at war. Watch waterfalls of pity roar. You feel to moan, but unlike before, you discover that you just be one more person crying. So don't fear when you hear a foreign sound to your ear. It's all right, Ma. I'm only sighing.
We're going to go back to Zoom. And I'll ask Cynthia to just, if you can, to mute your mic.
I'm sorry, say again?
Cynthia, are you able to just turn off your mic for a moment? Because they will feedback with one another. While we are waiting for our Zoom, perhaps we could give a round of applause for Cynthia for a beautifully written passage from the book. We got the evocative images, the music of the period, all captured by John Lewis and conveyed by Cynthia Henderson. Going to pick up our conversation. You tantalized us with a story. I'll come back to that in a moment. But while we have that sound in mind, when we have those images fresh in the mind, why are these two characters seemingly so doomed?
It's tough to say. I mean, it's definitely a kind of rehash of On the Road, this idea of finding freedom, hitting the road and as an expression of American individualism. And I think it's a statement about the era that they're making a journey east. And after the stop in New Orleans, which follows the murder of the Jack Nicholson character in the film as well, that there's just this feeling that this is yet another, hence the title of the book, Road Trip to Nowhere, that there's this desire to find America. In fact, that was the tagline for the film. And they find, I think they do find America. They find America circa 1969, and they find Nixon's America. And they find the Deep South, which is a frightening place in this era. And there's a feeling of inevitability in the film. And I think you asked at the very beginning, if as a 14-year-old, much of this registered, that did. The idea of being defined by having long hair, which I did as a 14-year-old, and having this sort of anti-establishment feeling. All of these things registered with, a suburban New York 14-year-old, and I bet it registered for a lot of young men and women in America that here is this, this journey to find yourself, which a lot of people were trying to do in that era, and they find something else, and what they find is a sorry, sad, dangerous, violent truth about America.
I wanted to ask about some of the fine detail and to extrapolate, to think a little bit about your writing process and your methods for approaching history, what we sometimes call historiography. And there's one moment in particular I wanted to just spend a moment to dwell on, and that is the account of the hippie commune and the fact that you go into detail to tell us that this is not a real commune, although it looks fairly authentic to the viewer, but recreated in in Malibu, California. It's ironic, but it does so much more than give us just production backstory and trivia. It tells us about the context in which the film is produced. It tells us about the society and the world that Hopper is exploring, and that fundamental relationship between the prevailing dominant culture, the counterculture, and these encounters, the moments where these worlds come together through Hollywood or through the moving image. I ask you just how that represents your broader approach of giving us these exquisite details to tell bigger pictures.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of film history is that it's about the movies to an extent, but it's also about a production culture that's complicated and built sort of fundamentally around the investment of large sums of money. And in the case of Easy Rider, here's this film from outside the mainstream production culture, not only thematically but factually, and it's really a film made by it's an independent film made by a small independent film company that even their encounter with the counterculture is ironic, because they were making a film very sympathetic about hippie culture. The scene's really interesting. There's this gorgeous, people don't realize this about Dennis Hopper in this era, because his career sort of falls off the rails pretty quickly after Easy Rider. He was a very sophisticated filmmaker, and he was really interested in the French New Wave, and he was really interested in direct cinema, which was this documentary film movement of the era. And when he shoots this, the commune scene, he has this one sort of gorgeous sort of dolly round in a circle shot that's straight out of Antonioni, who I talk about in the same chapter, and it's just of faces. There's almost an identical shot in Blow Up, a film that comes out a couple of years before, and he goes all the way around in a circle, and you just see these faces, and these kids are so earnest, but at the same time so clueless. So one of the characters, the Dennis Hopper character, says, well, they're doomed. They're city kids. They don't know what they're doing. They're trying to set up a farm in the desert. And the Fonda character says, no, they're going to make it because they believe. And you're sort of left as a viewer trying to figure out which one of them is right. And then the Fonda character wants to stay. He's discovered that they're doing the right thing, he thinks. But Hopper's impatient. He just wants to stay on the road. He thinks staying in one place is a bad idea. And so it's a really complicated, complex scene. And we discover fairly soon after this that they'd be way better off if they stayed there. It's the one and only place they're welcome in the entire film, which, again, speaking to American teenagers in 1969, this was a profound statement that there are very few places you belong anymore. And I think in a lot of ways that's why the film was so hugely popular, because a lot of people felt disconnected and abandoned, and this film sort of said, well, you're not alone.
The mistrust or the distrust between those of the commune or the real life commune, and somehow representing Hollywood, even though Hollywood saw Dennis Hopper as this otherworldly vision of the counterculture.
Yeah, but Dennis Hopper was a character actor. He was in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955. So, I mean, he had a career. He was fine. And Peter Fonda is Hollywood royalty. He passed away recently, but he's Jane Fonda's brother. And Henry Fonda's son. So, I think they looked at that more than the content of the film and just said, we don't, we've seen what Hollywood has made of us, so we don't want anything to do with that.
In terms of how Hollywood perceived the counterculture. Could you tell us a little bit about the reception of this film? And I know I didn't get to the production story or the anecdote you wanted to tell, so I want to give an opportunity for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of I think it's a funny story that all the studios wanted the next Easy Rider. And it's funny because one of the studios gave Dennis Hopper a boatload of money to make the next Easy Rider, and he made a movie called The Last Movie, which is this very strange Western shot in Peru, and it's just an absolute mess. I mean, there's no way around it. I actually saw a screening of it at a museum, and when you got out of the screening, they gave you a pin that said, I saw The Last Movie, as if, you know, a reward for making it through the film, I think. But one of the studios, Warner Brothers, again, trying to figure out, well, what is the message here? What is the formula? How can we repeat this? Said, well, the answer is we have to find some young filmmakers. And the young filmmaker they found was Francis Coppola, who had just finished up at UCLA and had written some screenplays that people around town were buzzing about. And they gave him $600,000, which isn't a lot of money. I mean, now it's nothing in Hollywood, but even then wasn't a whole lot of money. And told him to go develop some film ideas. And so he moved to San Francisco with his buddy, George Lucas, and John Milius, who would go on to make Conan the Barbarian and write Apocalypse Now. And they put together 4 films that they pitched to Warner Brothers. One was about a bunch of teenagers in Modesto, California, on the last day of high school, on the eve of, and it was set in 1969, so it was on the eve of getting drafted to Vietnam. And then there was a Vietnam film that was going to be shot in 16 millimeters, so small gauge film, low budget, by George Lucas, about American GIs surfing in Vietnam. The third film was about audio surveillance. And the fourth film was complete, and it was a science fiction film that Lucas had made as a student project called THX 1138. And they submitted all of them to Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers said, oh, these are terrible, we want our money back. And you probably able to guess at least some of these movies. The Modesto teenager film became American Graffiti, which was a huge success in 1973. The surfing in Vietnam becomes Apocalypse Now, makes $100 million and wins the grand prize at Cannes. The audio surveillance film is The Conversation, that wins at Cannes for Coppola. And THX is actually the only bomb, or the only film that doesn't make money. But of course, anybody who had gotten involved in that science fiction film by George Lucas could easily have gotten involved in Lucas's next science fiction film, which would transform Hollywood, Star Wars. So you're sort of one step, there's one degree of separation from Easy Rider to 4 of the biggest films of the 1970s, all of which end up somewhere else, not at Warner Brothers, which is, you know, I guess a joke.
We could chat for hours and hours and hours and hours about Easy Rider, but I do want to return us to Jane Fonda. We started with Jane Fonda and we'll end with Jane Fonda before we open out the audience Q&A. So be thinking of your questions. And John, I wondered if you could, before we delve into your pages once more, just give a little bit of context. And the passages we will see from, there's an overview, 4 women, identifying 4 extraordinary women whose stories tell us something about the role of gender and politics and Hollywood as a workplace in the 1960s and as a site of star images and of aspirations and cultural consumption.
Yeah, sorry.
Explore in detail beyond that.
I had always intended to use a story about a celebrity who, despite engagement in the counterculture, succeeded. And actually, initially, I was thinking of Warren Beatty, and I talk about him in the introduction of the book, and I talk about Bonnie and Clyde, but he's a complicated figure, and it was sort of in a way too distracting an example. There's just lots of things about Beatty that I would have to explain, and I kind of didn't want to. And then I thought of Jane Fonda, and actually I thought about Jane Fonda. I figured I'd have to, at some point I'd have to talk about Hanoi Jane, this whole, her trip to Hanoi, which was hugely significant in Hollywood, probably the most significant single act of Hollywood celebrity in this era. And right about that time, in one morning, I wake up and reading the newspaper, and it's just before Jane Fonda's 82nd birthday, and she had been arrested. And it was the story about how she went to this protest concerning global warming. And at that protest, there were the usual group of hecklers heckling her, calling her Hanoi Jane. This is, just right around 2019 or so, or 2020. And first I was sort of shocked. Well, wow, people are still calling her Hanoi Jane. But what was really interesting is that then they had this interview with her, and it was a warm day, but she had this big red coat apparently. So one of the reporters said, well, why do you have this big coat? And she says, well, I'm going to be arrested, and jail beds are really hard. And I thought, okay, that's pretty cool. And so she spent her 82nd birthday in jail. And as she was being sort of politely escorted off the site by the police, one of the reporters said, Jane, is it worth it? And she looked the reporter in the eye and she said, well, you're here. And I thought, okay, this is the coolest story. And I got really into looking at Jane Fonda's story as this example of someone who was moved and was part of the American counterculture, and yet still forged a hugely successful Hollywood career. And I think in some ways she's unique about that. And so I use her as a unique example. Quickly, I talk about three other women. Dolores Hart, who left Hollywood to become a nun. Barbara Loden, who was married to Elia Kazan and made this one movie called Wanda that's so brilliant, and then never did another thing. And Jean Seberg, who's in a way, along with Fonda, the most obvious example. She got involved with the Black Panthers, at the very least supporting them financially, and the FBI hounded her basically to death. So a very different story, very similar political engagement to Jane Fonda. In fact, they knew each other, but very different outcomes. So those are the four women I talk about in the chapter.
Without further ado, we will do a bit of technical magic just to get everyone set up. I'll turn my mic off. Cynthia will turn her mic on. We've switched here to the slides, and we will enjoy another passage from Road Trip to Nowhere. Hollywood encounters the counterculture.
For women in Hollywood. Los Angeles and the entertainment businesses that thrive there have always made room for women, albeit in roles suited to shared notions of women's work. Going all the way back to the silent era, women could find work behind the scenes in costumes, makeup, and hair departments, and further up the backstage ladder as editors and as readers and writers in studio story departments. Conventional wisdom held that women knew by instinct, no doubt, about clothes and makeup and coiffure, and that they were better or at least more avid readers than men. Thus, likely better evaluators, adapters, writers, and editors, a job that also requires a keen sense of story, form, and structure. The best jobs were left to men with ambition and pretension, men in suits, men with money, but for the many American women not in the movie business, the glass or celluloid ceiling wasn't so much of an issue because producer and director were not the jobs they dreamed about. Thanks to nearly a century of movie fan magazines targeting young women in particular, their dream involved some chanced Hollywood discovery of someday becoming a movie star. Movie star is a job title in Hollywood. And with that job comes a dramatic upward social mobility, wealth, and celebrity otherwise unattainable for the everyday American woman. Who then would not want to be a movie star? The question seemed for a century or so moot. Jean Seberg, Jane Fonda, Dolores Hart, and Barbara Loden all got discovered. They all got to be movie stars. But it was a sign of the times that each of these women risks their amazing good fortune to say or do things they fervently believed in. All four were searching for social justice, gender fairness or equity, a spiritually better life for themselves and others. To find something more, something better than just being a movie star. They were willing to risk everything, including walking away from the best Hollywood and arguably American job that was on offer. Hanoi Jane Fonda, December 20th, 2019. Front page, The Hollywood Reporter. Jane Fonda is back in cuffs again, protesting the Trump administration's failure to respond to the climate change crisis. Octogenarians are seldom page one news in The Reporter, but Fonda's cultural capital remains, after all these years, astonishingly intact. She's still relevant. On the day after her 2019 arrest, Fonda celebrated her 82nd birthday in jail, slyly remarking to the New York Times that getting arrested at her age has its hazards, like keeping balanced with bound hands. With age, they say, comes wisdom. And Fonda had planned ahead. She went to the protest anticipating arrest, so she brought along a thick red coat to double as a mattress cover. Asked if she thought this latest bit of civil disobedience would have much of an effect on the global climate crisis, Fonda gestured to the many reporters assembling around her. You're all here, so I think it's working. This time, the national press was mostly respectful, but not everyone at the scene was so inclined. One bystander participating in a counter demonstration wore a MAGA hat. He heckled from the wings, "Hanoi Jane!" And for those of us old enough to remember, the epithet brought us all back to Fonda's Vietnam-era anti-war activism. and a single photograph. A picture taken in July 1972, showing the actress seated astride a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun. As plenty of folks at the time observed, the gun might well have been used the day before to fire upon American jets. The image proved unforgettable. For many, unforgivable.
The success of McGovern has proven the many people in America who are speaking out against the crimes that are being committed in our name by Nixon and by the Pentagon, the people who are struggling to reestablish in America the qualities that we started out with. It is these people who are the real patriots. I lived in France for 7 years, and it was Vietnam, and it was the war in Vietnam who forced me to ask myself certain questions about America. And I went back to the United States because I wanted to fight there in my country, because I care about my country. And I think that I shed many tears in Vietnam. I cried every day in Vietnam. It was never for the Vietnamese. It's impossible to cry for the Vietnamese. They sing, they dance, they create. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. I didn't cry for the Vietnamese. I cried for the Americans, because although the bombs are falling on Vietnam, it's an American tragedy. The tragedy is ours, and it's going to take the American people many years to undo the damage and to wipe off the blight that has been put on our flag and our country by the likes of Mr. Nixon.
Fonda survived the counterculture, and she survived Hollywood. In 2014, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Film Institute. In 2020, Jane Fonda's career entered its 7th decade, and she was still a working actor. As we assess Fonda's personal and professional life, best to take her at her word. It's better to be interested than interesting.
A really remarkable image. And John, I wondered if you could just, it's a tough task, but could you take us back to the years that preceded this, leading up to 1972, and just give us a sense for those who maybe are just coming to Jane Fonda in her later years, didn't experience or haven't read about how big of a star she was in the 1960s, and then this politicized radical commitment to changing the world that has persisted for 50+ years.
Yeah, I mean, she's, you know, it's an amazing story. And you know, I was struck that as, you know, late as 2020, the epithet Hanoi Jane is still being thrown at her, you know, most likely by somebody who wasn't old enough to really understand the significance of that remark. I certainly remember, because I was 17, very different age, when Fonda went to Hanoi, and I turned 18, draft age, in the following year. In fact, I was in the spring of 1974 draft lottery, the last Vietnam draft lottery, sitting in a freshman dorm just up the road from you guys at Hobart. And in those days, there was one TV in the whole dorm. And all the men in all the men in the dorm were watching TV, and it was sort of like bingo. You know, they had all the little balls in this sort of cage, and your number would come up. And this is a contest you don't want to win, because the earlier you get picked, the more likely you get drafted. So I remember that here's this Hollywood actor at the top of her game. This is right after Clue, right after she's an Oscar win, she wins her first Oscar, and here she is risking it all by going to Hanoi. And it's a very complicated story. I mean, the photograph, fairly recently, she was on, I think Oprah asked her about the photograph, and Fonda talked about how she was just sort of fooling around. She was having fun, and she was probably manipulated. And they said, "Oh, go, would it be kind of a funny photograph to go sit there?" And the minute that they took the photograph, she realized, "Oh, this is going to be misinterpreted. This is not exactly the statement I want to make." But it was too late. And she affirms it was, that she was probably exploited, but then puts it in context to the ways in which the story about Vietnam had been exploited in America and sort of misconstrued and misrepresented in America. And in retrospect, her little story isn't anywhere near as big a tragedy, because it's a personal tragedy, as the war itself was. So yeah, it's, my context was that I was 18 years old and I thought I was going to have to make a decision, and I was really happy I didn't have to.
You mentioned the success of Clute from 1971, and that this remarkable few months in her life that she's collecting the Academy Award for Best Actress. And just a couple of months later, we see her pictured in Hanoi. I wanted to ask about her role within your book, and really her life and career more generally, this remarkable balancing act, being able to balance commercial success to a certain extent with this profound political commitment. In terms of your book, you mentioned she's unique. It's not a road trip necessarily to somewhere, but it's not a road trip to nowhere. The reason I say it's not a road trip to somewhere is because you also note all of the sacrifices and complexities of her subsequent life beyond this moment that she chose because of her beliefs at this time. Can you tell us a little about where she sits in your book and this balancing act more general, her unique status within our culture?
Yeah, I mean, the book part is maybe easier. I talk about her and Gene Seberg together because they were involved in the same kinds of fundraising activities, and were part of the same very politicized Hollywood subculture. Marlon Brando read a eulogy at a Black Panther funeral, and also donated a lot of money to the Panthers. Donald Sutherland as well, her co-star in Clute, was also very politicized. There were a number of Hollywood celebrities who, were involved in what would at the time have been controversial or unpopular political causes. And, Hollywood is a mass art, and it's all about not offending anybody. And certainly Fonda's politics and Gene Seberg's politics, though Seberg was nowhere near as big a star, had ramifications. And Jane Fonda's most likely was graylisted to a certain extent in the 70s. There are jobs she didn't get. There are directors who didn't want to work with her. There were studios that just felt that she was, it wasn't really worth the trouble, talented as she so clearly is. So I do think there was I'm sure there was a kind of reckoning that her ridiculously terrific career could have even been more, I guess, more terrific. But Fonda's, was politicized as she mentions in the little excerpt that you showed. In France, she was married to a film director named Roger Vadim, who was sort of known more for his sexual exploits than his politics. And among Vadim's inner circle were the actors Yves Montand and Simone Signoret. They were a couple. And France, of course, had their own experiences in Vietnam that had pretty much just ended before ours began. And she was at dinner one night, and she was having to explain Vietnam, or justify it, or explain, why the Americans were getting involved now. And it's really sort of there that she starts thinking about it, and comes back to the US and sees, because she's living in France at the time, comes back to the US and sees how significant it is, and sort of risks everything.
And
to-
continuing to risk everything. That's what's.
Well, you can risk everything and not lose everything. So she had to know that this could have, her career was just taking off. I mean, Kloop was this huge hit and established her as a serious actor. And she's, for people who haven't seen the film in a while, she's really quite terrific in it. And the film is very complex, and the film was very much embraced by the feminist community. So she became this sort of iconic leftist figure in all kinds of controversial ways. And rather than play it safe, she went with her convictions. And so, I don't know how many people would do that. I think it's just a really interesting story. So I was always going to use her or talk about her career as this one example where, this encounter with the counterculture wasn't a road to nowhere, that it ended up going lots of places, lots of interesting places, and kept going, for 70 years, which is, pretty amazing. But her story is unique in the book, at least, and I think in a lot of ways unique in Hollywood at the time.
I have 100 other questions, but I'm aware that we're running out of time, so I want to open up to our audience in person. I want to open up to our Zoom audience with your virtual hand, and we hope we can get to some of those questions. If you're in our audience, please raise your physical hand and we'll come to you with our microphone. Questions for Professor Lewis?
It's on. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and share some excerpts from your new book. We have read plenty of your readings in our class, and I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about what your research process looks like when you're going into one of these books, and the types of people that you're talking to, the sources that you're looking at, and if you found anything that was really surprising or what you kind of unearthed in this process.
Yeah, I generally am interested in the public record, and don't, because I can't talk to everyone, I end up not talking to anyone. And I'm really interested in primary sources, so newspapers, trade journals, interviews, and as far as and then my process is to assemble a kind of dossier and then try to see where it takes me, and sometimes it does take you a place that's really surprising. So I mentioned at the very beginning I was interested in this actor Christopher Jones, and the story that I thought I knew was that he had this sort of meteoric rise, and then he was in this film called Ryan's Daughter by David Lean, who had done Lawrence of Arabia and Bridge on the River Kwai, and was maybe the most celebrated director of the era of the 60s, and Jones had one of the principal roles in that film, which was quite something. because he had been in B movies and television before that. And he sort of had it made. And then that was his last film. And I had always thought, and I thought this because this was the story that you usually encountered about him, was that, you know, he made enough money, he bought a house, and he retired in his, you know, in his early 30s. Not really that interested in Hollywood, not interested in a career, not interested in the celebrity thing, and sort of blissfully spent his days as a painter, because that was the story. And then I discovered his biography was way more complicated than that, and his story was so much sadder than I thought, and actually didn't, in a lot of ways, support the argument of the book as much as I had hoped. So that he had begun as the sort of centerpiece, and then in the end, he's a different road to nowhere, into mental illness and drug addiction and homelessness, and it's an absolutely awful story. And I was really surprised by that. So sometimes when you do historical research, you come in with a kind of understanding that, you know, this is what I think happened, and I'm just sort of confirming it in the public record. And in this one case, wow, I found things that I didn't know about. And actually, at the end of the chapter, I say, well, you know, I thought this was a much simpler story than it is, and I thought it was a much happier story than it is. But it is a Hollywood story. It's a Hollywood story that maybe is less unusual than we think. And certainly it's not, the Christopher Jones story is I still think fascinating, just fascinating in ways I didn't expect.
Other questions? I see one right at the front here, Ali. And then Jonah over there.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. So you mentioned earlier that, you mentioned earlier that you researched a lot of people that didn't have the ability to make it in Hollywood, but you've also researched people like Fonda who have been very successful. And I was just wondering if there's any similarities or differences between the people that haven't made it versus the people that were successful, and in their adaptability to the changing times, and what we can take away from that as future filmmakers.
The last part of your question is really interesting. I'm very reluctant to give advice, and if I had the secret to how to succeed in the film business, I wouldn't tell you. I would do it. I really think, as a film historian, the one thing I've discovered is that a lot of the things we think we know, we don't. And that a lot of things that happen in Hollywood are happenstance, lucks. They're inexplicable. And in fact, that's what interests me about doing film history, is that it's never as simple as you think. And I've always been, for, you know, I guess narrative reasons, story reasons, I've always been more interested in failure than success. So maybe I know more about failure, you know, how to fail in Hollywood than how to succeed. Years ago, I wrote a book about Coppola, but rather than focus on the 70s when he made Godfather, Conversation, Godfather 2, and Apocalypse Now. So, you know, I don't know of a director who's had a decade like that, except for him. But then you look at the 80s and everything sort of falls apart. And I was really interested in that. So I don't know why, but I'm maybe more of an expert on how to screw things up than how to make things work.
Another question. This one from Jonah.
Hi, thank you so much. This is quite a spectacle to be talking with the author of one of our textbooks, so thank you so much. I'm curious on how you would describe American cinema today in Hollywood. Is Hollywood near to non-existent? How much does it differ? Or what are the major differences in past Hollywood? And how do you think we'll look back on this era? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be visiting with you and very flattered to be asked. So it's really my pleasure. Yeah, the new Hollywood. I would have been like you, sitting in an audience at a film event at my university in the 70s. And I'm certainly inclined to think that was the golden era of Hollywood. That's when, you know, Godfather, Taxi Driver, Nashville. You know, this is when, you know, American Graffiti, Exorcist, all of those films came out when I was in college. My dreams, when I went to film school, my dreams were fashioned by those movies. And just before that, this sort of discovery late of the French New Wave. And I think today, it's a bit of a harder sell. Hollywood's a bit of a harder sell to students. And because I don't think Hollywood exists in the same way. You know, the film industry in the 70s was a monolith. You know, you know, films were picked up on TV years after, and they were heavily edited for network showcases. You know, you don't have HBO, you don't have even VHS yet. And today there are just so many formats and so much content out there, ranging from stuff you can post on YouTube and Vimeo and on through films that cost, you know, $1 billion to produce. So the range of content out there is much more complicated. I'm not one of those of my generation who's going to say, well, everything was great in the 70s and everything stinks now, because I actually don't think that. But I do think that a lot of what I'm interested in as a film goer is probably technically not film anymore, and not only not produced on film because so little is, but mostly prestige, what's called prestige TV. You know, I'm much more interested in something, you know, like The Sopranos than I am in the you know, the Marvel universe, which doesn't interest me at all. So if you're asking me about the state of film and feature films made by studios, not that interested, frankly, and kind of disappointed at that fact. But I certainly think there's plenty of great content out there. It's just somewhere else. You have to find it somewhere else, and it's so available. And I don't know how many of you are dreaming of becoming producers of videotaped filmed content. I think there are a lot of places to go that aren't Hollywood, that aren't film, and maybe that's a good thing.
I just want to ask John a follow-up, which is on this notion of failure, because the failure as you describe it, John, in your book, is not necessarily how everyone would describe failure. These are heroic failures, or in some instances, failures by choice, or failures by choosing an alternative path, or simply not wanting to be in Hollywood as it existed at that time, inflexible to what the counterculture was proposing.
Yeah, I mean, and that was really my original idea in the book, stemming from the Christopher Jones story, but also founded with Dennis Hopper. I mean, Hopper makes Easy Rider, and he for that, you know, everybody dreams of having that moment where you're the it person. Everybody wants to talk to you. Everybody wants involved with you. And he just upped and moved to Taos, New Mexico, and decided he was going to build his own studio there and do his own work. And he was going to be his own boss at a time where he could have doubled down and just made a studio film and he was certainly talented enough, had a respectable, conventional career, didn't want it. And those are the people I'm interested in, I guess. That, yeah, I mean, failures may be the wrong word. But as far as giving advice, I mean, if you make your Easy Rider, any of the students in this room make a version of Easy Rider for 2024, and you're given the choice, well, you know, here's a boatload of money, but make a movie that is going to be commercially successful. And you say, no, I'm moving to New Mexico and I'm going to invite all my friends there and have parties and build a movie theater and build an art gallery and create an artist conclave close to the spirituality of the Native American community there. I'm going to make movies that matter to me. And that's what Hopper did. I'm also interested in one of the people I talk about in the very first chapter that, isn't a household name at all is this guy, Mark Frechette. And Mark Frechette was the star of Antonioni's film, Zabriskie Point, which was MGM's attempt to make an American counterculture film. And the film didn't succeed with the critics and didn't succeed at the box office. Was really problematic to release because it got an X rating. But still, Frechette was the star of this Hollywood, in some ways landmark Hollywood film, and certainly could have had a kind of conventional, respectable career. And he quit to become part of a commune in Boston called Fort Hill. And the story, falls apart from there. He robs a bank, gets arrested, goes to jail, and then dies in jail. And this is somebody who had everything, who had Hollywood, he was a leading man in a major Hollywood film and certainly could have had the conventional respectable career and just simply walked away. His co-star in the film, same story, though she's still alive and didn't rob a bank, but actually got into self-help and became a kind of self-help guru. And so these are the stories that interest me, that you have this sort of moment where you can have what everybody else in America seems to want. And then when you get it, you decide, yeah, that's not what you want. Jean Seberg, same thing, she had everything, and then she had to know that getting involved with the Panthers was going to be a bad idea. But she felt that her celebrity and her wealth was something that she needed to exploit to help them. And she certainly sacrificed her career for the politics she believed in.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask a concluding question. I see so many hands up. It is cruel. You're in demand, John. But let us, Steve and Neat, right at the front, just because you're easiest to get to.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Earlier in the evening, you kind of talked about Easy Rider and how all the studios wanted to mimic its success and would throw boatloads of money at filmmakers to try to recreate its success unsuccessfully. And in today's day and age, when studios are throwing money at remakes, sequels, prequels, do you think this is like a classic case of history repeats itself? Is like the film, are the studios not learning anything from the past, or do you think that something has changed? Maybe they have learned something, but we just don't see it.
Oh, I'm gonna come across a bit cynical here. Yeah, they don't learn anything. No, I think what Hollywood's encounter with the counterculture was, in some ways, they didn't learn anything and only got out of it through a series of lucky accidents. That a couple of the directors whose work they had a first shot at, the films created by a company called American Zoetrope, which was the company Coppola formed with George Lucas in 1969 to, with Warner Brothers money to sort of make the next Easy Rider. But the studios thought the next Easy Rider would have to involve motorcycles and have to involve hippies. And they didn't understand that, no, it was a sensibility. It wasn't a plot. It wasn't a formula. It was something bigger than that. And they refused to trust that. And I think Hollywood likes formulas. That's why you get all these sequels. That's why you have the Marvel universe, where the films are basically all the same. I don't, you know, it's an unpopular thing that I often say, you know, in conversations with students, that I just don't get those movies. I don't even understand them. I don't understand why everybody likes them. But that's pretty much all the studios make now. That's why there are these other places. I'm not saying there's no film culture. It's just film culture's gone somewhere else. It's you know, gone to HBO and Netflix, and it's still big companies running these things, but on the smaller scale that those companies operate on, you get, I think, more interesting content. So yeah, I'm pretty cynical about Hollywood learning anything from really the turn of the 20th century to now. I mean, it's always the search for a formula and trying to just sort of keep doing the same thing until it doesn't succeed, and then try to find a new thing that you can then rehash a million times. So yeah, I'm cynical, I guess.
I have a final question, John. It's a big one. You're looking back when you take us to the 1960s, the counterculture, all of these different encounters. What is the lasting legacy of the 60s counterculture on Hollywood in particular, but also on the wider society that we have all inherited? What do you see as the big things that we should take? The road trip, the road movie, it's often about the journey, not the destination. If the destination is nowhere, that doesn't mean there aren't incredible things to discover along the way. What are some of those things that you discovered in looking back, and that we should look out for as we approach your book and think about this era?
Wow. Yeah, I've actually never thought of this. I don't know. I don't know what we should learn. I was fascinated by this era because I was fascinated by a handful of personalities who seemed to, you know, have embraced the counterculture, whereas Hollywood, you know, really never got it, and it came and went before they did. There really is no, you know, there was a sort of no moment when Hollywood was sort of churning out counterculture films. They just never got it. There, and in 1976, it's interesting. The two memorable films from 1976 are Rocky and Taxi Driver. So this is sort of when this era sort of screeches to a halt, and it's sort of, you know, in some ways Hollywood's looking at two different futures, Rocky and Taxi Driver, and I think we can guess which one they took, and maybe even guess why. So maybe that's the lesson that, you know, the counterculture happened. It was really complicated. The studios didn't understand it. The people involved in it, I don't think, understood it, because of course, right in the center of the story is Charles Manson. And a whole lot of people in Hollywood had just a couple of degrees of separation from that house where all that happened on Cielo Drive. And a whole lot of Hollywood celebrities could have been there that night because they had been there before. And so that's at the center of this too. So there are all sorts of, I guess, lessons here. But in some ways, it's just, you know, Hollywood is this incredibly, in the big history book, the one that you all are using in the class, you know, one of the things that's for sure is that Hollywood is flexible, and the endurance of the system is quite amazing. Hollywood is this sort of notional thing too. You know, it's not a place anymore. It's something larger and more complicated than that. But the industry, the entertainment industry, is incredibly flexible and incredibly adaptable. And maybe what's interesting about the counterculture is it didn't have to adapt to it, because it came and went before they had to. But they're still adapting. You know, they're adapting to technological changes, to material changes, to attitude changes, to the way in which this new generation even watches content, which is very different than the way I did when I was their age. So I think that maybe that's the big lessons that, you know, Hollywood is, you know, there's no end of cinema in sight, even though nobody makes movies anymore. But certainly Hollywood endures.
I have to get up for this next bit because I want to grab. I'm just running off stage, returning with this in hand. John Lewis's remarkable book. You mentioned that the counterculture came and went, but you capture it in vivid detail. I commend it to everyone. We've had a wonderful conversation. We wish we could keep you for hours and hours and hours. There are more questions, but we will let you go, John. We appreciate it so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me, inviting me.
A big thank you to Cynthia, to Jane Fonda, to tonight's audience, the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, the Park Foundation, and all of you here tonight. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening. John, thank you again. I hope you heard the round of applause that time, but
I could see the hands. You can't hear anything.
well, thank you so much. There were a lot of hands asking for an opportunity for more questions, but we reached the end of our time with you, John, and
Well, if they'd like to email me, I'd be happy to answer their questions on email. So
you are too kind, and thank you again, John.
Yes, thank you so much. This is such a pleasure.
oh, hi. Yes, well, my pleasure.
Yes, it was such a pleasure. Have a great one. Thank you so much. This was an amazing event.
Okay, well, yeah, I thought so
And
too.
congrats on the
really
book.
jazzed. Well, thank you.
I'm in the middle of reading it right now, so.
Oh, well, good.
Yeah,
I hope you like it. I appreciate it.
I am indeed.
I'm very flattered by the invite, and I really enjoyed myself. And the Jane Fonda part was just so over the top. I don't even know what to say. How fantastic that was. So thank you so much.